Tonight's talk is called The Book of Job and a Tale of Initiation. We're going to explore the Book of Job as a spiritual myth, not myth in the word as we know it today as a false statement, but a representation to a particular truth, and that truth is the tale of initiation. I got the idea of this talk. The Dalai Lama came here to speak, and he talked about staying with our religion, not just switching because we didn't like the organization. And I remember Annie Besant wrote somewhere that the Theosophical Society doesn't want you to leave your religion, it wants you to live it. So since I was a recovering Catholic, and I used to give tours here, and many people I know said the same thing. So I started to really think about, the teachings of Christianity or the teachings of Catholicism and or of Jesus and what they really mean to me. And so I was in meditation. My best meditation happens to be while I'm folding clothes. And the story of Job came to my mind, and I said, wow, this is life. This is how life happens. Stuff just keeps coming at you, and it seems relentless at times, and there has to be a purpose for it. So Pablo and I were talking, and he gave me the name A Tale of Initiation. Now, when you do a talk here at the TS, and I'm sure it's most places, they schedule things about 6 months in advance. So this is the name that stuck. But as I was going on, there were some different names that I liked better, and we'll get into that. I'll save that for you. The excerpts that I have, the quotations that I have mostly from here, come from Madame Blavatsky's second book of Isis Unveiled. And there's a whole section in it on the Book of Job. When I was researching for this, I used the Theosophical Classics system and put in the Book of Job. And it's not called the Tale of Initiation because I went back and looked for it tonight. But if you put in the Book of Job, all these different excerpts come up. And then what I did the other day was I sat down and I read the whole excerpt from start to finish, and it really gives a better picture of it, to read it out of the book. So that's where we're going to start. And then a little footnote here, or a little side to get going. In Christianity, it is talked about the two parts of our being, a body and a soul. And that body represents the source of our selfish tendencies, the passions of the flesh. And then the soul, or the spirit, is our higher nature, or that which is talked about as the Jesus nature, or the Christ nature. Now in Theosophy, they also talk about two parts. It's really a sevenfold being, but I broke it down. I like to think of it as two parts, a higher nature and our lower nature. And that lower nature consists of our desires, our physical sensations, our emotions, our thoughts. And those are usually coming from a very limited place. They're the things that we want that keep ourselves preserved. There's only so much money we can have. There's only so much stuff we can gather. So all those desires are coming from a limited place. When we can bridge that gap and tap into our higher nature, we're coming from a higher perspective, a perspective of unity, of one, and of limitlessness, and one that's eternal. Okay? So I will touch on, within the talk, this higher and lower nature. So just keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so when the Job effect happens, or that's what I named it, was the Job effect, it's just those little irritations. And I understand why they come to me. I need to learn to not react, to be calm in the face of all this little stuff. When I was preparing for the talk, I've been preparing for quite a few months, and so things come to me, and so I wrote everything down on these little note cards, and I thought when I come to sit down and put everything together, I'm going to have all these note cards together, they're all in one place. Well, this weekend I went to look to that place where it was, and I couldn't find them anywhere. I searched my house, I cleaned my house, my kids were looking, Pablo was looking, and I just couldn't find him. So that's part of what I call the Job effect, those little nuisances that happen. So on our way over here, I was telling Pablo I was a little nervous about, I said, because, you know, what if this is part of the Job effect, and I have to get up and learn to, you know, trip and fall on my face and get up and just keep talking. And he assured me that when you're doing work, serious work, that it doesn't happen. So the Job effect should not go into effect here and now, and I should be able to start and finish my talk without any mishap happening that's supposed to build some character within myself. So, all right, with that, the nature of myths. Myth was the favorite and universal method of teaching in archaic times, but we ought perhaps to explain the ancient use of allegory and symbology. The truth in the former was left to be deduced. The symbol expressed some abstract quality of the deity, but the allegory was reserved for the inner sanctuary, when only the elect were admitted. Okay, the actual definitions of allegory are symbols that stand for ideas about human life, specifically human life, and then the symbolism is a method of revealing or suggesting immaterial, ideal, or otherwise intangible truths or states. So this will help us as we go through. The book of Job is part of what is called the wisdom literature. And this is sayings of wisdom intended to teach about divinity and about virtue. Techniques of traditional storytelling are used, but also offers insight and wisdom about nature and reality. And then the book of Job is usually recognized as a folk tale of a man extremely patient in the face of suffering, the patience of Job. Now, Madame Blavatsky is very clear about what she thinks about the book of Job. These two sayings here, I think one, or these two little tidbits here, are ones I got off of the internet. I got off of Wikipedia one, and I don't remember the other. But so it's common thought that of what myths are, or what these sayings, or where this wisdom is coming from. All right, so the basic history of the book is that the book of Job is one of the books of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. It dates back to patriarchal times, and this is the era of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's around 2000 to 1800 BCE. The authorship is unknown. Madame Blavatsky has some words on this, and she says there is a total absence of allusion to any of the patriarch, and so evidently it is the work of an initiate. And then Job comes from the land of Uz, which I found could mean east. It could be somewhere around southwestern Jordan and southern Israel, southern Arabia, southern Syria, Uzbekistan, or just beyond the Euphrates. Okay, Job was known as a wealthy man, living with his large family, many servants, and extensive livestock. But he is undisputedly known to be righteous, blameless, and upright. And he was always careful to avoid doing evil. He would make sacrifices on a regular basis in case one of his family members did evil or thought evil, or his servants. So he was very cautious about this, and he was always very mindful of it. So he made his sacrifices to God just in case. Okay, the organization of the book. In the Bible, it's broken up into three parts. The prologue, where Satan and God are having a conversation, then the middle part, And this is the cycle of speeches, and there's 3 speeches between Job and his 3 friends. It's dialogue, okay? They talk and Job answers. They talk and Job answers. They talk and Job answers. And then there's a 4th, Elihu, that comes in. And then after that, it's the dialogue between Yahweh and Job. And the final part is the epilogue, and this isn't very long, as you can see. And this is where God rebukes Job's friends, and then Job is restored, comforted, and blessed. All right, so part 1, the dilemma of Job. Like I said, this is where God and Satan have their conversation. And God brings up, and he's just kind of bragging, hey, check out my buddy Job. He's, very righteous. He loves me. He sacrifices to me all the time. And Satan says, well, yeah, right. He's got everything that he needs, that he wants, and more, so why wouldn't he do that? So Satan comes up and challenges God and says that if you give me permission to give him a little trouble, he will not be the same. He will turn and he will curse you. So God says, okay, go ahead and torment him. All right, so one of the interesting things I found when I was doing the research was they called what we call Satan, they called him the Satan. And it was very specifically written that in the Hebrew Bible, the Satan is primarily understood as an accuser or an adversary, and not necessarily the personification of evil that he would become later in Christianity. And Madame Blavatsky says, in this poem, clearer and plainer than anywhere else, do we find the meaning of the appellation Satan. It is a term for the office or character of public accuser, an office quite as respectable as that of the public prosecutor in our own age. In 4 very specific events and very pointed, Job loses everything. Okay, one of his servants comes and says, Job, your livestock has been taken away by the Sabians, and your servants were all killed. I am the only one that survived. Then Job kind of is like, whoa. And just as he's able to wrap his head around that, another servant comes in and says, Job, your 7,000 sheep burned from the fire of God which fell from the sky and killed everything and all your servants except for me. Then the 3,000 camels were stolen by the Chaldeans, and the servants went with them. And one servant came running and said, Job, I'm the only one left. Everything's gone. All right, then the 4th one, the house of the firstborn was destroyed by a mighty wind, they say a tornado, killing Job's 10 children and their families, except for the one servant that came running to tell him that it was all gone. Okay, so Job kind of bows his head and says, okay. Job, in this case, Job's resignation. He doesn't curse God, but instead he shaves his head, tears his clothes in mourning, and says, naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. Lord has given, and Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It is common, a common religious theme of resignation, and that's this unresisting acceptance of something as inescapable, a submission. When situations are unrelenting and happening by seemingly random acts, there is nothing to do but resign. And it's at this point that we stop asking questions. Because for so long, when things happen, we ask ourselves, how did this happen? How could I have prevented it? Who can I blame? But it seems when the stuff just keeps happening one right after another, there comes a point that you can't ask any more questions. It can't be anything. There has to be a reason for it. So this is this resignation. All right? And then there's a point here in Theosophy that suggests that the stuff that happens to us in this lifetime is not from this lifetime. It's a karmic debt that needs to be paid from previous lifetimes. So nothing we've done, even, and that I think is one of the hardest things we have. I'm a good person. I'm a nice person. Why is this bad stuff happening to me? But when we realize that it's not coming from this lifetime, it's a little maybe easier to take. But the key point is that what we do with it, our reactions to it, and how we move forward is what creates the karma for our future lives. So that's really important. That's why we have to go through this with a certain attitude. Okay, then Job's health is destroyed. He is smite with dreadful boils, and then his wife tells him just to curse God and die. And Job answers, and this is very common in the Jewish religion, to bless God for everything, good and bad. But he says, "You speak as one of the foolish speaks. Moreover, shall we receive good from God and shall not receive evil?" All right, part 2 is the discussions with Job. And what happens here is this is where his 3 friends come in. And his 3 friends are described as a learned man, full of knowledge, another a conservative, taking matters as they come and judging Job to have done wickedly, and then the third, an intelligent and skillful man with generalities but not interiorly wise. And what they do is they come and they feel so bad for him, they just sit there in silence for 7 days. And Job finally breaks the silence, and then he curses the day he was born. And then there's these 3 cycles of speech. And Job's discussions with his friend are mainly on the origin and the nature of his suffering. Job's friends believe he must have sinned to incite God's punishment. They increasingly berate him for refusing to confess his sins, although they themselves are at a loss as to which sin he has committed. And they assume that God always rewards good and punishes evil. And this is common in here. Our friends want to help us. They truly, truly feel bad for us. But when they can't figure out a logical reason, you have to be doing something wrong. And if you're not doing something wrong, and they can't find that reason, well then if something bad happens to them, then it's going to not be able to make sense. They can't wrap their head around it. So I found that this is common in there. Then Job kind of, is able to gather his resilience. But this is also a common theme. Take away my stuff, but don't take away my reputation. If I can think of myself as blameless and upright, then go ahead, do whatever you want with me. But as soon as I find that my reputation or who I am is being attacked, then it kind of like ups the ante, and I find that that's something that bothers me. There's always things that we can accept, different aspects of it. All right, so Job then gathers himself, and he's confident of his own innocence. He maintains that his suffering is unjustified. He has not sinned, and there is no reason for God to punish him thus. He does not curse God's name or accuse God of injustice, but rather seeks an explanation or an account of what he did wrong. All right, in steps the 4th. And this is, well, let me go back here one more. This slide, or this dialogue with his friends, also brings another point. The masters in Theosophy talk about it being very important to be able to endure a personal injustice. And we can see in history that many men and women have had to overcome this personal injustice, or not actually overcome it. They've actually been killed because of it. You have Hypatia of Alexandria, Giordano Bruno, Socrates, Jesus himself. If you know the history of the Theosophical Society, and Madame Blavatsky went through it, Charles Leadbeater went through it, Annie Besant went through it. So it's this personal persecution that we kind of have to learn to endure. And Charles Leadbeater said of this, the way in which the world usually treats a new truth is first to ridicule it, then to grow angry about it, and then to adopt it and pretend that it always has held this view. Unfortunately, in the meantime, the first exponent of the new truth has probably been put to death or died of a broken heart. And we can see this, that happens many times. Okay, so Elihu is the fourth. And here he says, or it's said of Job finds one who answers to his cry of agony. He listens to the wisdom of Elihu, the Hierophant, the perfected teacher, the inspired philosopher. From his stern lips comes the just rebuke for his impiety in charging upon the Supreme Being the evils of humanity. God, says Elihu, is excellent in power and in judgment and in plenty of justice. He will not afflict. All right, Elihu's wisdom seems to be speaking from revelation, where his friends spoke from self-thought knowledge. And it's that knowledge of the lower self, those concepts, that knowledge we learn from day to day. Elihu seems to have tapped into that higher self and is able to get to that innate wisdom, that revelation. All right? And here he explains that suffering may be decreed for the righteous as a protection against greater sin, for moral betterment and warning. And he admonishes Job to stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. And to me this is very similar to be still and know that I am from Psalm 46:10. And then from the voice of the silence, before the soul can hear, the image or man has to become as deaf to the roarings as to whispers, to cries of bellowing elephants as to the silvery buzzing of the golden firefly. For then the soul will hear and will remember, and then to the inner ear will speak the voice of the silence. And this is also, this whole theme here is coming from our lower self and bridging that gap into our higher self. Our lower concrete mind, or what we call that monkey mind, is chattering all the time. And it's chattering with our emotions and our thoughts and our sensations, and how can we fulfill these needs that they have. But it's not until that mind is silent that we can hear the whispers of God. Yes?
Didn't one of the things Job lost was a bunch of monkeys?
Oh, I don't know that.
I thought it was listed on your
No, donkeys. Donkeys. Okay, I didn't think monkeys were a very valuable livestock in the Middle East. All right, but yeah.
Got rid of donkey mind.
Donkey mind, that could work too. That could work too. Isn't that a game? All right. Okay, so the other thing that's happening here is Elihu is preparing Job for what is about to follow, and that's namely the voice of God from the whirlwind, the speech that follows. It's also the direct experience or the illumination that's spoken about in Christian mysticism. All right, so the deliverances of Job. God finally interrupts from the whirlwind and says, "Who is this that darkness counsel by words without knowledge?" And really what he's doing is he's admonishing Job's friends too. The fault of Job and his friends is in trying to explain the nature of God with only the limited information available to human knowledge. So here Job suffers physically through his illness, socially when his reputation is attacked, mentally when he's asking the questions without getting any answers, psychologically when he's struggling to hold on to a sense of integrity from what society tells him, and spiritually when he feels cut off from God. And this cut-offness from God is also known as an eclipse of God. We hear the story where we think God is walking with us, and then as soon as something happens, we only see our own footprints, and then they say, "Oh, well, I was carrying you." Well, that's part of it. And the other part of it is when we have that monkey mind going, we can't hear anything from God. So it's known as the eclipse. Something's just in the way that we can't get there. All right. Annie Besant said something similar to this, but I couldn't find her quote, and I'm terrible at paraphrasing stuff. So I found one from Albert Einstein where he said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." That's like trying to teach a toddler or a 2-year-old something when acting like a 2-year-old, or trying to teach my teenagers something when I act like them. Although it's a nice effect for a couple minutes if I start throwing a little temper tantrum. Okay, the other thing that the suffering can, or the effect of the suffering can, one of the positive things that it can affect is that our physical and our emotional and our mental needs are actually alive. They're something called elementals. And they get cranky, they throw tantrums when they're not paid attention to. And if we can starve off that energy to them, they will eventually die. And that's called, dying to the lower self. All right, what God starts talking about out of this whirlwind, and when I was reading through this part of the book of Job, I got the feeling that God took my view from this more personal view and took me above it all, where I could get a more universal view. And he talks about his greatness, this greatness and the expanse of his creation. The other thing that I got from this was God, what I think we do a lot of times is we expect God to come to us. We want him to be here, and so we make this personification of it. Instead, what the really important thing to remember is that what we actually want is we actually want to lift our consciousness or raise our consciousness up to his level, or raising our consciousness to get in touch with the spiritual intuition, the grace of God, the Buddha nature, or the Christ consciousness. And this is important from just a purely energetic standpoint. If one of the masters or Jesus has to come down here in their physical form, we all know, you all heard about vibrations. When we take on matter, those vibrations are heavier, and that energy can't get out as much. When that energy is on one of the inner planes or on the higher planes, then it exponentially grows and can do much more work than it can down here on the physical. So the other thing God talks about is tapping into this nature of the higher self, and when we do this, we'll be able to see beauty as the wings unto the peacocks, the strength that hath thou given the horse, the wisdom of the hawk, and the freedom of the wild goats on the rocks. I don't know if you've ever read the book of Job, but I hadn't until I read this. And I'm not a person who enjoys poetry. I would rather read something and get to the point really quick. And he gives a lot of examples. You really get the idea by the time you get finished reading it. And then with all good story, it has a lovely ending. The story ends with Job restored to health, comforted with a new family, and blessed twice as prosperous. So that's my little synopsis on the book of Job. And then we come to what I call the Job effect and the path to initiation. And I changed it from the tale of initiation from the path to initiation. And this is what we are working on every day, whether it's, and I have no ideas that I am ready to be anything but just a menial helper and working on my own personal stuff. And I call it the microcosm within the macrocosm. But there are 3 paths, and there are things that I can do every day. The first path I call the evolutionary path, and that's the stop and smell the roses around the mountain. The second is the spiritual or the religious path, and this is the front of the pack around the mountain. And then the third one is the occult path, the straight up the side of the mountain, pathless path. Annie Besant, in her book, In the Outer Court, the first chapter talks about this mountain. And on top of the mountain is this outer court. And this outer court leads to the inner court, which is inside the temple. And the temple is the initiation. Our job is to get from the bottom of the mountain to the top. We can either take the scenic route and go around with most of humanity. This evolutionary path, if I stop and I say, oh, look at this little alcove. It has a nice cave, a nice little brook, nice trees. I'm going to sit here and hang out a lifetime or so. Okay? And then I'll get back on the path and start again. The spiritual path is those movers and shakers who are saying, okay, I have a path to follow because this path is well worn, it's beaten out, and it's the path of our spiritual. We know what Christianity asks of us. We know what Buddhism asks of us, or Hinduism, okay? Or even Theosophy. It's well written out, and it's a path to follow. Okay, then we have down here the occult path. And this is where, okay, I'm not going to wind around anymore. I'm going straight up the side of the mountain. And I need to go straight up the mountain because I want to get there as fast as I can. And this, unfortunately, is a pathless path. There are other people on you, but for some reason that path grows over really quick. They can tell you about it, but you can't find it. It's something that you just have to kind of blaze your own trail. So this is this occult path is what leads you to the initiation. Okay. All right, the book of Job is a complete representation of ancient initiation and the trials which generally precede this grandest of all ceremonies. Back in the day, it was spoken more of the trials, the initiation ceremonies, and one of these like in the mystery schools. And the lesser mysteries is what our Masonry comes out of, okay? It's that, this representation of the ancient initiation. And then Madame Blavatsky also says, during the trials, the neophyte perceives himself deprived of everything he valued and afflicted with foul disease. So this is that Job effect. All right. Okay. Now, the steps on the path to initiation are threefold again, too. And that's the preparation. And this is done by us alone and in our daily life. And it's matters of the heart. It's what the seeds that are in our heart that we are watering, are fertilizing. Okay? In Job, he was righteous, he was blameless and upright. And he was very careful to avoid evil doing. So once he was able to sow those seeds in him, he was prepared for the next step. And this next step is the probation. And it's the candidate goes through trials as a test and a training. This is the Job effect. This is his trials that he went through, the loss of everything. And then the final step is, you know what I want to say about this too? I wanted to add to this. I think a lot of times what we think is that when we're tested or when we have a trial, that the only way to get through that is if we succeed. So if my test is to get through a situation without reacting, if I react within that situation, I failed the test. And that's not true at all. And for me, that was a really uplifting point to get across. And that is that if my intent is to do the very best I can and to do this, and I've given myself up as my duty or my responsibility to stay on this path and to do everything that I can, then I've already done it. If I walk through it, if I endure through whatever it is, then I've succeeded. I don't necessarily have to do it happily. I don't have to do it perfectly, but I just have to get through it. Krishnamurti talks about living life joyfully or going through the troubles of our life joyfully. And I can tell you I am anything but a joyful person when I am in the midst of a trial. And I think there's more to, I haven't looked into it because it just seems so far-fetched to me, but what I think he means is enduring, starting, finishing, and then not being resentful and bitter at the end. But while you're in the midst of it, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe other people have a secret to be joyful, and I'd be happy to listen to that. But I haven't been able to do that quite yet. All right, so the initiation is where the initiate undergoes a transformation and attains power to help. I don't know if I say this anywhere else, but it'll be good to reiterate it. Annie Besant talks in the book In the Outer Court that this initiation or this path is a path of service. It's not a path to get powers. It's not a path to be happier. It's not a path to attain stuff, but it's a path of service. And she really stresses that it is this service. Once we get that in our head and we get through the initiation, then we have a direct experience from God, and this is this whirlwind. Now, with that microcosm within the macrocosm, what we're also doing is tapping in to that higher plane on smaller occasions. And then eventually it comes where we've perfected our lower nature, and we're able to tap into that higher nature on a regular basis. Okay, so why suffering? Human beings are the battlefield of good and evil, spirit and matter. They are caught up in a kind of crossfire, a warfare, part of a greater cosmic drama we are not aware of. And this, to me, the center of, let me use my little pointer. The center of the TS emblem here is two triangles. This white one is this triangle pointing upward, and that represents spirit. And then we have the darker triangle here pointed downward, and that represents matter. And if you notice that they're intertwined. And this is where we are right now. We're at the juncture or the entanglement of spirit and matter. We started out as spirit, as pure spirit, but we were an unconscious spirit, like an infant. And in order to become self-conscious, we have to evolve down through matter, through minerals, through plants, through animals, to where we are today at our human nature. And then we're in this entanglement. And then our job is to continue that and evolve back to spirit. And so it's this U-shape. I don't know if you've heard Pablo's other talks. It's that U-shape diagram or that U-shape symbol that you start here where it's pure, and it's pure here, but this is a more self-conscious spirit. Okay, so Mahatma K.H. says in the Mahatma letter, in one of the Mahatma letters, our earth occupies the lower turning point where spirit and matter equilibrate. All right, so we have suffering as growth. Annie Besant says the first question we have to answer is, what is the object of religions? They are given to the world by men wiser than the masses of people on whom they are bestowed and are intended to quicken human evolution. And this was really important for me because, yeah, I know about the initiation thing, but that seems so far off to me that, you know, why do I have to suffer right now if it's not going to happen for lifetimes from now? But to quicken my human evolution, that I can understand, okay? I can understand that I have this purpose. So that's why I put this quote in. And then she also says that the soul grows in the dark hours when a problem of action is presented to it that is unable to solve. And this, in a microcosmic way, these are those Zen koans. That we get that are just unsolvable. But what it does is it helps us tap into that higher mind, that abstract thinking, just so we can have practice to get to that higher place on a more regular basis. And then Nisargadatta says, acceptance of pain takes you much deeper than pleasure does. The acceptance of pain is the denial of the self, and the self stands in the way of true happiness. All right, so suffering as a test. Every affliction tests our will, showing whether it is inclined to good or evil. This is why an unforeseen affliction is called a test, because it enables a man to test his hidden desires. And we are given options all the time. Our choices that we make and where our choices are made from determine if opportunity of options grows wider or grows more narrow. If our choice of option comes from a selfish, personal self, where it's only going to make me happy, I'm only doing this because it's bringing me comfort, I want what I want, then our options become narrower and narrower. But if we can come from a place of unselfishness or selflessness, then our options increase as we go. Okay? So Mahatma K.H. says, "It is but a truism, yet I say, that in adversity alone we can discover the real man." Another thing about this is we have seeds in us, and we have seeds that are very dormant. We have seeds of good, and we have seeds of evil. And those dormant seeds can lie dormant for many, many, many lifetimes. And when we step on the occult path, all those seeds need to be nourished, and all those seeds need to come forth so we can see what is what and pull out the weed and weed the evil seeds out. So his course of testing is that of Raja Yoga, and its result is to develop every germ, good and bad, in him, in his temperament. And the reason that this happens is because when we are able to tap into that power of the occult forces, if we haven't weeded out these germs or seeds of evil, they become more powerful as our power grows. And then we have more power to do evil than we did from down here. Right now, those seeds of evil are pretty, lessened in me. But as I gain power, if I haven't rooted out those seeds, then those evil seeds become more powerful. And I think it's an exponential growth too. So, suffering as service. Annie Besant says, "The service of a great soul which bears suffering and offers it for the spiritual life of the world, so that it shall be changed in the fire of love and come back as spiritual energy to be spread over the whole of the world for the raising and the helping of man." And this goes back to her service, her path, the path of service that she talks about. All right, so initiation itself, I just wanted to touch on that, but there are lectures that could go on for weeks to talk about the initiatory process. So I just have two things. Thanks to our TS Wiki, it broke it down nice and simple and concrete for me. So in the Theosophical tradition, this refers to a series of events that take place out of the body on the inner planes, and in the presence of the masters of wisdom, where the disciple is taught and trained in some aspects of the occult science and the esoteric philosophy. The process of initiation also involves an expansion of consciousness to the higher planes. Now, a little disclaimer here, a series of events that take place out of the body, okay? We have to go through a specific process in order to get to the point to get to here. By learning to do out-of-body experiences does not get us to that point faster. There's no shorter route than straight up the mountain. So just because we have fancier boots or a nicer poles to help us walk up doesn't get us there any faster. We still have to go through the trials and testing and suffering. All right, so the first initiation expands the consciousness of the disciple into the Buddhic plane. The new initiate is born into this new life of the spirit, and the expansion of consciousness he attains consists in his having opened to him for the first time the great spiritual world in which all truths are known by intuition, not by reasoning, in which the eyes of the spirit are opened and direct knowledge of the spiritual truths is gained. Knowledge becomes intuitive instead of rational. And right here is the intuition versus the reasoning, and the intuitive versus the rational. Right there they're talking about our lower mind is rational, it's concrete, it functions by reasoning. Our higher mind functions by intuition, by abstract thinking, okay, by thinking deeply, by pondering hard about readings, about the readings that we do. At this point, let me finish this and then we'll go on to questions. What I did was I just found these books that were helpful for me to explain this process. Annie Besant wrote In the Outer Court, and this is the one I've already touched on. Rohit Mehta wrote Seek Out the Way, and there's a couple different Seek Out the Way books, but this is the one by him. And just reading the table of contents kind of gives you a good idea of where the book is going. And these two things, these are the two chapters I remember the most, the raging of the storm and the state of loneliness, because at particular times those things happened right after another. And I remember having a dream once that I was standing in the middle of the TS, completely by myself, just standing out in the middle of the field. And it was right after, you know, you go through the storm and it seems like everything's taken away from you. Okay? And then The Diary of a Child of Sorrow. I loved the name of this book. And Elias Gerwertz was a TS member. These are the chapters in this book. And then Evelyn Underhill writes a book about mysticism, and these are the chapters that she talks about there, which also explain this occult process. There were a book, a Zen book, that was called, If You're Lucky, You'll Break Your Heart, or It'll Break Your Heart. And so it seems like books like that I find more of those books instead of the books that say, you know, happiness is for everyone, the quick path to, you know, true bliss. So, and then to finish up, I have two quotes that I live by. And one of them is, deserves got nothing to do with it. Can anybody tell me who my guru for that is? He's a very spiritual man. That was Clint Eastwood from Unforgiven. Okay, deserves got nothing to do with it. And I saw it years ago, and that's always stuck with me. And then the last one is, see if you can guess this one. Yes, I am wise, but it's wisdom born of pain. I don't know.
Part of a song.
Very good,
Helen
very
Reddy.
good. Yay, bing, bing, bing. Very good. Helen Reddy. Okay, so those are my two little things. Let me finish here, because I call this the Job effect and the path to initiation. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes?
There was this quote by Annie Besant talking about the suffering as service, saying something that suffering offered for the spiritual life of the world, so that it shall be changed in the fire of love and come back as a spiritual energy. I don't know, that's an interesting quote. Do you have any comments on that? Like, the suffering is turned, according to what Besant says there, is turned into spiritual energy or something like that.
Right, this could, a lot of times I found when they talk about fire, they're talking about that alchemy, that turning that lead and with heat and pressure into gold. Or they talk about it in the metamorphic process of stones. I think it's metamorphic. The heat and pressure will turn coal into a diamond. So if you take that suffering and under pressure, pressure with a heart that is ready to give, then what it does is it lifts the burden of humanity a little more. I think of it too in my egotistical way. Every time I stand up for wronged that's been done, I'm doing it for people who can't stand, in my case, for women who can't stand up. Every time, you know, I face a challenge and I get through it, no matter how I get through it, I do it for somebody who can't do it for themselves. So when I liked this quote because that's what I think of. It takes that suffering, that I'm not just suffering, and I'm not just doing it for me. I'm just not doing it to make me feel better. I'm doing it to help lift the burden of those that can't.
What about Job's wife?
Yeah, you know, I usually have a comment about people's wives because I watch them very carefully. But you know what? I didn't see anything about her wife except that if she was had raised 10 children, and she was pretty tired.
She had her hands full.
She had her hands. Yeah, that's all she could handle. Job was on his own. He should be able to take care of himself.
Yeah, but she lost the children. She
how did
suffered.
she feel?
She
Right.
suffered maybe more than Job.
No, I know. No, like I said, that's a very good point, because what I usually, and now that you brought it up, I'm thinking, because usually I go to the wife. Usually I don't pay attention to what happens, you know. I saw the movie The Last Station about Leo Tolstoy, and it's, you know, about this great life of his and everything. But what I did was I researched about his wife, who Helen Mirren plays, and she does a great job. And everything I read, it talked about how she was a hysteric, that she had this hysteria disease. And I thought, okay, so she marries this man, she gives birth to 13 children, loses 5 of them, she homeschools them, makes sure they have all this stuff. Meanwhile, she rewrote War and Peace 7 times for him, and made a publishing, you know, got all his works together, gathered it, and then when all her kids are grown, in the time for her to spend time with him, he decides he's going to be celibate and doesn't want to have anything to do with her. Yeah, I would go a little crazy too. Okay, so there's a lot. So yeah, I will have to think about that. Could be a whole nother talk.
Yeah, I don't know about that also, but many times these kind of myths can be interpreted as each character being a part of the human being. So all the characters is a person. So maybe thinking on those lines to see, well, obviously Elihu would be a representative of Buri, or
right.
You know, and God Adman, and Job Manas, and see the wife, what it could represent. Because the only thing that or the little that we know about the wife is that she says, okay, just curse God and die, you know. So it would be interesting to think it in those terms and see what we can come up.
Because his friends could be the lower mind. So really, there's only the emotions, maybe the emotion part of it, you know, because of the female part there. So yeah, that would be interesting.
Michele, we talk about the suffering and the initiation. I guess we can maybe at some point look forward to, is that when the Buddha nature, the Christ consciousness, where you don't need the push of suffering to get to this level, you've got it, so you don't need the push?
Definitely. There is, I was told at one time that karma always ends. That no matter what karmic thing you're going through, that it will always end. Unfortunately, the law of cycles say that it just might be, you know, it might come back. But there is a point, if there is a point in our evolutionary process that yes, the suffering, the karmic debt will end, the trials will end, the testing will end, and then we can live in this state of bliss. But that is the state of the perfected human. And the way it was explained to me is we have an evolutionary stage as minerals, we have an evolutionary stage as plants, we have one as animals, and we have one as humans. The evolutionary stage of the perfected man, or the Mahatma, the masters, is a completely different evolutionary stage from what we're in now. It would be thinking that an animal could jump from being an animal to a human in a lifetime. So we cannot jump from our human being self to this perfected man in a lifetime. So that was real eye-opening for me. And there are numbers. Blavatsky gives specific numbers for, it's like 418 million years.
Yeah, but those are symbols.
Right, but they're big symbols. She's not saying 6 days. Okay, they're pretty big numbers. Go ahead.
Yeah, when we read about the initiations, it seems that the experience of suffering changes, because during the trials and all that, I think one of the aims is that the person discovers like the secret of suffering. And many times you see in these books when the person discovers the pleasure in the suffering, not as a masochist, but the idea when pleasure and pain are united and transcended. So there may be, difficulties later on or a certain suffering, but it's a completely different experience of that. And of course, when the person is a Mahatma, Michele says, probably is completely beyond even the idea of suffering. But yeah, usually the idea is that the hardest part is when we go from, a good person to a sage, that transition, the trials and all that.
Okay, we good?
So I have one more question.
Oh.
If we, we're talking about a mountain, we're talking about a path, and if we take this nice circuitous path and we stop and smell the roses, it seems like our suffering is kind of distributed, over time, and we could take it a little bit by bit. And if we're going up the side, it seems like it comes hard, and then, it comes fast. But do you think that it just, how do you make that switch, or what causes you to switch to say, well, I'm going to hit the path, so here I am, let it come at me, or how do you think that works?
I think some people purposefully make that switch. Those are the people that I've heard that, they say they have studied comparative religions for a long time, or they chose this lifestyle, for a purpose. And then there's other people who, because of the seeds that are in their heart and the things that they've done in the past, that it kind of puts them on that path without even knowing it. And that's why the suffering can be so hard, is because you could be on that path and not know why, and not understand why is all this stuff happening. Otherwise, you can make a conscious effort and say, okay, I'm going to, really work on this part of my nature. I'm going to, Theosophy says service, study, and meditation. So I'm going to really work on that. But it also goes along with, if you don't know that this suffering's coming along, be careful what you wish for. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so in Job's case, it seems like he wasn't aware.
No.
He didn't say, I want to enter a path. It just, bam.
Right.
It kind of.
But because of the seeds that were in his heart, because he was very, very particular about making sure that he thanked God for everything, that he took care of everybody around him, that he, made his sacrifices, that he was aware, and so you could look at it as God said, well, hey, this is a perfect guy to go straight up the mountain, so let's just,
Let's get him started.
Yeah.
So one more question. So in that age, it was, I think you said 2,000, 2,500 before the Common Era.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, was karma known in the East? And in the biblical areas,
right,
it just seems like they didn't know about it or didn't talk about it.
Well, I think at one point in time, the laws of nature were more common knowledge, and people lived more by those laws than we do now. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it was called karma, or you just understood, or.
Karma is a Sanskrit term.
So
there must be a similar term in every language.
Right, right,
You know,
and
action, cause and effect.
right is still the same.
Yeah, but maybe I think in the West there was more of this idea that whatever comes from God is good, whether it is pleasant or
Right.
you know, I don't know if there was and they talk about the divine justice of God. I don't know if there was idea of the law, but the way they took it is, you know, I love God, why would I choose only what I like? I just take whatever comes from
Right,
Him.
right, yeah.